Join the Coven. The siege of Area 51 will not end well. The final chapter. A story written by WeirdBryceGuy. One last time, I told myself as I stood beyond the base's fence, while my fellow raiders surged throughout the compound, knocking over soldiers and thrusting open doors. I had yet again attended the siege of Area 51, though this time I neglected to associate myself with a raiding party. I would need to move alone, surreptitiously, if I was to complete my mission. I would also have to prevent the release of that damnable trio who had been unleashed upon the base during my last visit, and who had established some sinister cross-cosmic link with my mind. Our numbers seemed even greater, and the base's meager assembly of soldiers, some who fought as if they had never seen true combat, only managed to resist the onslaught for a few minutes. After their forces fell, ours claimed the base and spread throughout its various buildings, searching for extrasolar visitors and artifacts. My first destination, the building in which the dormant telekinesis-capable aliens were housed. It was unmanned by any guard, and I waited in the shadows of the nearby building's awning for the arrival of my past group. It only took a few minutes for them to appear, and I saw the familiar faces of the one adorned in tactical gear that had named himself leader, the belligerent one named Kyle, and the unnamed others. A guard had fallen nearby, either dead or rendered unconscious, and it was from him that I had taken the rifle, which I aimed at the group preparing to enter the building. "Do not open that door," I shouted, voice laden with authority, although I doubt I looked the part of someone fit for commanding others. They turned weaponless and threw their hands in the air. I motioned for them to move away from the door. They complied, and I began marching them away from the structure. Before we had gone far, the leader put his hands down, and before I could question his sudden resistance, a blow struck me in the side, knocking me to the ground, and the weapon away from my reach. I turned, and before I could focus on my assailant, a boot came down hard on my stomach, and a knee followed, landing on my chest, ejecting the air from my lungs. A man, stout, and dressed in what appeared to be an X-Files shirt and ripped jeans, squatted atop of me, his fat, sweat-slicked hand wrapped around my throat, and through his yellow teeth he hissed, "Traitor," while his eyes glared at me with a crazed intensity. My vision went red, and the world around me seemed to grow dull, as if filtered through a crimson haze. As he strangled me, I remembered that I possessed those life-saving appendages known as arms, and with a weak strength, tried to push the man away. My efforts were nothing against the weight that bore down upon me, and it seemed as if my death would not be at the hands of some hyper-cosmic being, but a fat, alien-hunting lunatic. Just as I thought to accept my demise, a shot rang out, and the man that knelt on my chest fell away with a pained grunt. I scrambled to my feet, winding myself in the rapid ascension, and looked around for my savior. A soldier had his rifle raised, trained not on the shot man, who writhed in throes of agony on the ground, but on me, and with a fierce, commanding voice he said, "Leave now, or you'll be next." Before I could even think to protest, he sprinted off to deal with a large commotion to the east, in which several detonations of some kind had gone off. Ignoring his orders, I scooped up the rifle and sprinted towards the building. The door was open, yet the inner door had been locked, and I surmised that the group had already entered. I banged on the door, demanding they leave the contained creatures alone and exit the building. But they either did not hear my shouting or chose to ignore it. I considered firing at the access panel, hoping it would somehow override the system and allow me passage. But before I could discharge a shot, I heard a heavy thud, and an automated voice announced the initiation of containment protocols. The bulkhead had descended and the room was totally locked. I swore and exited the building. I knew the series of events that would be shortly underway, and without my presence there to facilitate their escape, those within would surely die some gruesome death at the hands of the freed aliens. There was nothing I could do from outside, and I hadn't come all this way just to restart yet again by means of the time teleportation machine. I needed to find another way to end the madness, regardless of what it cost me. I ran to a sort of courtyard in which several hundreds of the invaders had convened, and pushed by as they shared information and made plans of action to besiege buildings in which guards had fortified themselves. I ignored most of what had been said, and kept my head down so as to avoid drawing attention to myself. Should someone recognize me as the girl who turned a gun on her own side? As I passed through the throng, I heard a piece of information that made me stop in place. I listened intently. A woman had said that the building to the south had a sort of vault in it, and that nothing short of a high-yield explosives could breach its thick, reinforced door. Those who listened deemed it a lost cause and made plans to enter other, more easily accessible areas, and the information was discarded from the group's collective mind just as easily as it had entered. I, however, considered it very valuable information and resolved to gain access to the stronghold. I figured that whatever lay inside that nigh impenetrable vault may help me in undoing the mess of this raid, and stop the aliens who had most likely broken free of their confines. I hadn't yet heard the screams or the mass stampede that would surely arise from contact with the three entities, but I didn't want to stick around and see what happened. I found the building the woman had mentioned, and agreed with her conjecture that it would take quite a sizable explosion to bypass the vault's massive door. Its lock system seemed like something out of science fiction, with a massive rotating wheel and several smaller dials of unguessable purpose, along with several supplementary locks, a keypad, and a scanner of some sort. There were at least 500,000 people that stormed the base, and even if every single one had simultaneously launched themselves against the thing in a singular wave, it would not have even budged an inch. My problem of getting past the massive door was solved almost immediately, as if my unspoken prayers were heard and answered by some benevolent deity. A group of people had exited a hangar, riding on several alien vehicles similar to those I had seen during the last raid. Mounted on a few of the vehicles were two cannon-like armaments, and judging by the ease on which they blew through the hangar doors and the opposite building's wall as the projectiles continued their aimed path, I speculated that concentrated fire from those weapons would punch right through the vault's door. I hailed the riders and waved at the vault's door. They sped towards me, and, halting the vehicles to hover in place, fired at the impassable barrier. 3 vehicles, each with 2 cannons, spat greenish missile-like projectiles at the door, and after only a short volley, the metal had been melted away, revealing a cavernous, unlit room, Just then, a scream rang out a few dozen meters away, and the riders shouted out their well wishes and sped away. I was alone to uncover the mysteries of the vault. The vault's interior was unblemished by any sort of decoration or fixture, and not even the typical machinery I'd come to expect was seen anywhere within. As I progressed into the darkness, I noted a strange wetness to the atmosphere and an accompanying smell that suggested the presence of a body of water. If not an entire aquatic ecosystem, a strange yet potent observation, and despite the desert location, the air was thick with the olfactory elements typical to a water-based biome. My passage into the greater darkness was at last met with a point of visible interest. A pool set within the floor and spanning the width of the building sat before me. Its still, black waters revealed nothing, nor did they reflect my figure as I attempted to peer within its surface. With time dwindling and the destruction of the base by the hostile aliens imminent, I then acted somewhat impulsively. I fired a burst into the strange water, hoping to stir from dormancy whatever strange creature dwelt therein. I half expected a violent outburst, some aqua alien retaliatory being that breached the surface to see whom had disturbed its slumber, but for a few moments after the shell casing stopped clinking against the ground, nothing happened. It was only when I considered firing once more that a change within the still waters occurred. A figure reared its head, and then shoulders, and then an entire upper torso cleared the water's surface, and its almost human morphology was a welcoming sight, though at the time I knew not why. "You took long enough." The creature, though partially submerged in the water, was still noticeably short, standing no taller than 5 feet. It had 3 eyes, just as the malicious aliens had, yet the triangular formation of its visual organs was in an inverted order to those of the hostile beings. The tip of its triangle pointed down, whereas theirs pointed up. I stood, utterly shocked at its appearance. I certainly hadn't expected to be spoken to, especially not in such casual English. "You seem surprised. Funny, do you think they would have kept alien hostages for so long without establishing a means of communication? We were allowed to study your dictionaries, pore over your literature and scriptures until our grasp of your languages was as efficient as your most learned scholars. We know the cultures of your world as well as we do ours." I realized I still had my weapon aimed at its general direction and lowered it quickly. The creature hadn't seemed to care either way, and continued its speech, still submerged in the black water. "A few select members of my species arrived at your ever-contentious rock a few decades ago. I was part of the exploratory party that came to investigate whether or not you people had attained an echelon of civilization compatible with their own. If you had, we would have revealed ourselves and suggested extragalactic trade between our species." I watched intently, and only after it had spoken for several sentences did I realize that its thin-lipped mouth never moved. Its words were telepathically transmitted directly to my mind. "We realized that your species was still in its infancy and planned to depart, allowing you the necessary centuries to develop to a level with which we could adequately converse. However, we were captured, and in staying true to our interspecies interaction protocols, opted to allow our imprisonment. We could have easily broken free and alienated your Western civilization, as you dubbed it. We stayed true to our virtues and decided to learn as much as we could from you humans, in the hope that we would find some common ground on which to build a foundation of sentient cooperation. You and your people greatly value triumph over others, and my species have been the victors of countless struggles, well before the early creatures of your planet crawled from the primordial mire. But enough about us. You've come here to find answers, to see how you may end this horrible, repetitive nightmare. I am the last remaining member of the party that first descended upon your planet all those years ago. The rest of my people have, to put it in words you could understand, perished in experiments by your military. Though their souls persist elsewhere, I've remained here, awaiting you. I've seen the future, mine, yours, and all who dwell within the sphere of casualty, and have determined that only with my assistance may you end this tiring succession of events. The alien then strode towards me, abandoning its lake-like home. It was similar to the aliens I had seen before, yet smaller and without talons. It had 3 large fingers without nails or any sort of protrusions. Its purplish skin radiated with a slight bioluminescence, which was admittedly quite beautiful. Allow me to take you to the room in which your destiny has been so troublesomely entangled. The alien then clasped its hands, and a brilliant pink light filled the air. When my vision cleared, we had been transported to the room in which the time teleportation machine had been housed. We were alone, and due to the alien's almost magical relocation of our forms, the door hadn't been bothered. I ran to it, made sure that its lock was secured, and sat against its cold steel surface. For once, I was not in a rush to do something. The assisting alien looked upon me with the same smiling demeanor as a parent would a child, and I felt a fleeting feeling of shame. My human inclination to ensure that the door was properly secured was most likely a whimsical thing to beings who could translocate by a mere thought. Having caught my breath and accepted his presence as benign, I questioned him as to how he knew of me and my goals. His responses would have floored me if I hadn't already been seated on the ground. Why do you think it was so easy to get in? You gave them 2 months' notice. Do you honestly think they wouldn't prepare for such an event and allow you to just storm in without taking advantage of the situation? They welcomed you all along. You were meant to find all that you did. They orchestrated the siege, hyped it up, and placed all the secrets practically at the front door. It wouldn't have taken more than a small military effort to deter the thousands of you. But they put on a show, killed a few of you, even so that your victory seemed earned, felt real. It was all an experiment. They bioengineered those things to have latched onto your mind. When we were first captured, they extracted our DNA, tweaked it, weaponized it, and created those towering monsters, even providing them with telekinetic abilities exclusive to my species, and decades after stabilizing their creations. You all were the first combat test. The teleportation machine, as you've called it, is what they've dubbed a reality splitter. Initially built to as a sort of super sophisticated virtual reality projector, they found that with the inclusion of my species' technology, the realities they fabricated could be made real, be given material substance by projecting them into sort of pocket dimensions, the locations of which they discovered through our stellar cartography devices. You left your original timeline, to use your own terminology, and have been bouncing through duplicates, microcosms of your world, where events, people, and the space are as real as anything else. Essentially, each time you activate the machine, You are creating a new domain and populating it with live clones of everyone here, even derivative reality splitters, though the one in your world is still the master device. Your government has created a world engine, and to every born world, you are God. Using the data of these not-so-unreal simulations, the government will perfect their experiments and use them as a spearhead for all offensive military operations. Imagine a world in which these creatures exist, your world, and the chaos that would follow. Once strong enough, smart enough, they could raze entire cities, destabilize entire civilizations in days. I'm not sure how many simulations the military expects or needs, but in just the second one, the creatures had destroyed this entire base and established a cognitive link with you that stretched through dimensions. They have proven themselves to be reality warpers. My question for you is, what will you do now knowing this? The only way to stop this nightmare is to return to your true timeline. I can show you how, and how to collapse all the others, thus destroying them entirely. You must then destroy the true base, killing the creatures, soldiers, and achieving the destruction of this machine. It's genocide of an unprecedented scale. But if you don't act, if you simply let things play out, these abominations will eventually cast aside your government's flimsy control of them and alienate your species. I'm sure of it. Time seemed to pause. I was at a total loss for words after the alien's exposition. And if it had been spoken by anyone other than this undeniably extraterrestrial entity, I would have laughed in their face. As I digested the information, I came to realize that a worry had grew within my core, not for myself, nor for the countless sub-creations which must be destroyed if I hope to end the cycle, but for this creature before me, who had allowed himself to remain captive for nearly a century. If what he said was true, his consciousness, and all derivatives that existed in the worlds created by the world engine, would be eradicated. If I understood the convoluted machinations of the confounding machine, as if sensing my thoughts, the alien spoke. I have been dead for centuries, in thousands of realities, and have yet to be born in countless others. The entity that I am, and the species from which I hail, are eternal, and as essential to this universe as the very atoms of which you are composed. I could not die. Truly, even if I wanted to. Go now. Be free of this dreadful causation. The alien held out a hand towards me, as if pushing some invisible force, and before I could respond to its statement of immortality, I felt myself thrown through the immaterial sections of ultra-reality that separated my origin from its subsequent clones. Depthless voids yawned before me, and were subsequently left in an immeasurable distance as I sped through the higher cosmos, propelled by the forces of my newly acquired alien companion. After a while, I found myself back at the base, in the room of the teleporter. I knew it to be my own reality, the original place from which I had traveled, and resolved to complete the mission laid out by my otherworldly guide. It took a few minutes of fiddling with the machine's controls to find out how to permanently collapse the realities I had foolishly created. With a hesitation born of empathy, I delayed in approving their destruction. I had created thinking, feeling beings, entire worlds, and wondered if I could truly live with the utter obliteration of uncountable lives. It was only after the alien's words had echoed in my head, I stood before the control panel, that I resolved to finish what I had started. If I had relented, a multiverse's worth of lives would have been subjected to the terror of those experimental creatures. I activated the termination sequence and ascended the stairs that led up to the upper grounds of the base. I then input the necessary commands to initiate the device's self-destruction protocol, which, in theory, could obliterate the entire base. I gave myself 10 minutes before activation, and in that time frame, I've recorded this message using the machine one last time, passed it through the linear, non-divergent tunnel of space-time, which hopefully ends in the past of my respective timeline. I'm sorry for all the trouble I've caused, the lives I've sacrificed during my selfish invasion of this base. To whomever receives this, forgive me. Do not participate in this raid. If its effort should ever come up again, or if somehow the base survives the destruction I've meant to inflict upon it. If I fail, and the base continues to exist, rise up. They can't stop all of us, and it will surely take every last person who has pledged their participation to stop the evil our military has created.